Hey, what's up everyone? Welcome to another Therapist Reacts video. Today we are getting an update on the Ruby Franke case and the Jodi Hildebrandt case, as Ruby Franke's husband, well, I should say pending ex-husband as he has filed for divorce, Kevin Franke, has actually filed, I don't know the legal term, a suit or something, demanding that Jodi Hildebrandt pay restitution for the damages suffered by Kevin and Ruby's children, as she was providing mental health care for the family, doing marriage counseling for Ruby and Kevin, as well as when the children were in her care. And I say care with heavy emphasis on the air quotes. And so today we're jumping into this law and crime sidebar that talks about the court filings that Kevin Franke has filed and what that means for the two cases. As always, please like and subscribe. That helps you to stay up to date with our content and make sure that you don't miss any of our videos, and so that we can continue creating videos for you all. So let's dive in.
My deepest regret and sorrow for my family and my children. Guilty.
How are Ruby Franke's two children doing in the aftermath of this horrific abuse? Well, we may have just gotten a glimpse through new court filings where Kevin Franke, Ruby's estranged husband, is going after Ruby's co-defendant, Jodi Hildebrandt. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law and Crime. I'm Jesse Weber.
And this is where I want to get into the mental health pieces of this case, because understandably people have not wanted the children to have to be witnesses, to have to testify to what has been going on throughout this case. As attorneys and spokespeople for all the parties have said throughout the course of these cases, they don't want the kids to have to testify. They don't want there to be a trial so that the kids don't have to testify. Again, whether or not you believe that that's why they don't want to have a trial, that's not the point. But the point is that potentially sharing some of these abusive experiences, talking through them in a courtroom setting rather than a therapeutic setting, and also not having much time to heal in between that, depending on what kind of mental health care they've had in between. All of those things could mean that testifying could actually be another traumatic experience, especially if there happens to be cross-examination and how the attorneys for the defense decide to handle things like that. So all in all, it could be problematic. And so this is perhaps the first glimpse that we're getting into how all of these proceedings have affected the children. So let's keep watching. I will be jumping through some of the early parts of the video because he does a review of the case up until this point. And if you're watching this video, you've probably seen other videos that catch you up to speed on all of that. So I will be skipping through some of that.
Ended up having all these injuries from being tied up. Both the kids were not provided adequate food and water, and in more extreme examples, Franke admitted to kicking her 12-year-old son Russell with boots and holding his head underwater, and Hildebrandt forced Eve, Franke's 9-year-old daughter, to jump into a cactus. I mean, we're talking horrible, horrible stuff. Both women are set to be sentenced in February 20th to be exact, and each charge carries 1 to 15 years in prison, and based on their plea agreements, these sentences will run consecutively, meaning one after the other. But now, let's talk about the new development. In a filing from Randy Kester, who is representing Ruby's estranged husband, Kevin, he actually filed for divorce after Ruby's arrest, he is demanding restitution from Jodi Hildebrandt. In other words, he wants her to literally pay. For what? For the effects of what she did, namely the medical costs. The document says, quote, "The children have undergone medical care and have been subjected to psychological assessments and ongoing mental health treatment in an attempt to assist them in comprehending and recovering from these injuries."
I want to pause on this statement real quick because there's a lot going on here and I want to break it down. Yes, medical care, absolutely. Mental health care is considered medical care, and as such, it is also not cheap, unfortunately. So one thing that Jesse Weber is going to allude to later on is that from the brief time that Jessie Hildebrandt, Jodi Hildebrandt's niece, spent with Jodi, I think that they had said it was less than a year, that they had been in therapy since that time up until now, and they said it was probably like 10, 15 years that they've been in therapy. And so this is not a short commitment to therapy and ongoing psychological assessment for the kids. There could be some massive costs associated with that. And as they are children, it's really important that this filing actually includes a language of them comprehending these injuries. It's important that they understand that the abuses that were done to them are just that, abuses. It's not just punishment or discipline or parenting in any sense, but that they were being abused, it was not appropriate, and there has to be a lot of relearning and retraining through conversations with trusted adults, conversations with counselors and therapists potentially, to relearn what a parent and child relationship should look like and what it means to be cared for, what it means to be trained properly, rather than just being told that they're evil or possessed and have to be punished over and over again for something that they didn't do. And on top of that, of course, you have potential trauma response kind of symptoms, disturbed sleep, depression, loss of interest in things that they used to enjoy, anxiety, hypervigilance. There's a whole list of potential things that somebody who suffers from abuse or a trauma response could be suffering. Kitty, what are you doing? Oh. Ooh. Kitty wants to get closer to the video.
Mental health treatment in an attempt to assist them in comprehending and recovering from these injuries. The children remain in professional care for the aggravated psychological and emotional injuries suffered. It is clear and admitted that the children suffered immediate and continuing irreparable harm as a result of the crimes perpetrated upon them by this defendant.
So what we're talking about, I think this is kind of in legal terms, something that we see in mental health world as well, that you have immediate or acute symptoms that show up. And so that could be the sleep disturbance, the hypervigilance, maybe some difficulty with emotional regulation, and continuing harm could be some of those long-term or prolonged symptoms. Sometimes people who have PTSD will also lapse into depression, substance use, anxiety, kind of long-term things that, while the immediate harms also sometimes don't go away without treatment, you also have some of these long-term symptoms.
And it goes on to state that the children will require long-term professional care moving forward, likely for many years. Now, based on what we read about these kids and what they went through, none of this should be surprising, because on top of all of the physical abuse that I laid out, and there is a lot more, let's not forget what the plea agreement also says, that the kids were forced to repent, that they were evil, that this punishment was being done for their own good. Can you imagine what that's like for two young children to experience that and try to recover from that?
He makes a good point. There was not just physical abuse that we're talking about here, but as we talked about in other videos, there was emotional abuse, and I'd say even the emotional abuse was primary because all of the physical abuse was supporting the emotional messages of you are an evil person, you are possessed, I think he said, and you have to repent. And all that goes towards methods that allowed Jodi Hildebrandt and Ruby Franke to control these children. And that's what emotional abuse is, tearing away someone's self-image using words or actions so that you can better control them through fear, intimidation, and their low sense of self-worth.
In fact, I remember when I interviewed Jessie Hildebrandt, Jodi's niece, who also claims that she was the victim of severe emotional and psychological and physical abuse at the hands of Jodi Hildebrandt, but she talked about the psychological trauma to come for these kids.
The emotional and spiritual abuse, I mean, it took me, I mean, I'm still in therapy every week for it. There's no, and again, it was almost 15 years ago, and I'm still daily, like, I mean, through this experience for months, there's been a tremendous amount of healing on my end, which just goes to show how important accountability is for the victims.
Right.
But no, I mean, this doesn't, the invisibility of harm.
I do want to touch on what Jessie Hildebrandt is saying, that accountability is super important for the victims. A lot of times in traumatic events, implicit beliefs kind of get rewired. So for instance, a lot of people have a just world way of thinking. Good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people. And so in this kind of situation, if the kids continue to get abused and punished, and the adults who are perpetrating that keep getting away with it or are getting paid to do it, that just world kind of thinking starts inserting itself, and then the kids might start actually believing like, oh, since all of these bad things are happening to me, that must mean I'm bad, and since these adults are getting all the good stuff, that means they're good. And so I actually deserve all of these bad things. And so that accountability that Jodi Hildebrandt is talking about is super important, because that's a repudiation of that, to show that actually that was not right. There's legal authority that is saying that even though these adults got rewarded and money for all of these things that they did, that is actually not right. And that's super important. Help rewire those beliefs in people who suffer from abuse or trauma.
Almost, it makes it even worse, because you know, if those kids didn't have those horrifying physical marks on their bodies, would this ever have been intervened? And it's horrifying, but like the marks that of the emotional abuse will significantly outlast any physical.
Now, the way that we understand it is that the state is paying for all of these expenses because the kids are in state custody. So they're paying for this treatment. But Kevin is actively seeking full custody of these kids. And if successful, which in this court filing suggests that the custody issue could be resolved by September of 2024, eventually he will have to be responsible for these costs. The filing states, quote, "Once the juvenile court matter concludes, the cost for this ongoing critical professional help will fall upon the children and their father. This would be a completely inequitable result that the victims and victims' family would have to pay for their own treatment for injuries caused by the defendant."
I think that's fair to say, especially if you had someone who was in a position ostensibly as a helping professional and there was clear malpractice there. There does need to be an accountability for the way they were put in that privileged position and that they abused it. So I think in any analogous case that would be true, but even doubly so when you have someone who was hired on to prevent the very things that they were doing.
Now, to be clear, there is law cited by Mr. Kester in this filing to support this. It's called the Crime Victims Restitution Act. And in Utah, this law states, quote, "When a defendant enters into a plea disposition or is convicted of a criminal activity that has resulted in pecuniary damages, the court shall order that the defendant make restitution to any victim of crime as provided in this chapter, or for conduct for which the defendant has agreed to make restitution as part of a plea disposition." Now, there are also two forms of restitution. So in determining restitution, the court shall determine complete restitution and court-ordered restitution. Two separate things. Complete restitution means restitution necessary to compensate a victim for all losses caused by the defendant, and court-ordered restitution means the restitution the court, having criminal jurisdiction, orders the defendant to pay as part of the criminal sentence at the time of sentencing or within 1 year after sentencing.
All right, so legal experts, I'm going to tag you in again. So comment below. I feel like in this case, it should actually be A and B. So is there precedent for there to be full restitution as well as court-ordered restitution? Because I think in terms of the damages and the costs incurred for the medical treatment, yes, absolutely, that should be paid by Jodi Hildebrandt, right? There's also kind of a non-physical cost, and what I'm referring to is that betrayal of trust that she was in, for some part of the time, a professional relationship, that she had a fiduciary duty to this family as their therapist, even if she was not doing it properly and she had a dual relationship with Ruby Franke as a business partner. Putting all that aside, she betrayed that fiduciary duty to be a professional for them. And so I feel like even if there aren't specific damages associated with that, there should be some extra restitution on top of that. So let me know in the comments below what your opinions are on that.
So it's a little bit different. It overlaps here and there, but one is about compensating the victim fully for what happened, and another is a part of the sentencing. Now, also I should tell you that the court will consider all relevant facts when determining restitution. If Jodi objects to the restitution, quote, "The court shall allow the defendant to have a hearing on the issue unless the issue is addressed at the sentencing hearing for the defendant." So it seems that we may get more of an answer on this, or discussion at the very least, at the sentencing hearing, or it may move over to a future hearing. And by the way, Kevin is only going after Jodi Hildebrandt, which is not surprising since Connections was basically her business. She founded it. But also, he wouldn't go after Ruby for the money. But it also is very consistent with A, the statement from Ruby's law firm before she pled guilty, where she put basically a lot, if not all of the blame on Jodi for what happened. But B, Randy Kester, when we interviewed him here on Long Crime, has said that Jodi was the driving influence behind Kevin's separation from Ruby. That
We did hear about this in other cases too. A lot of the victims who have spoken out about Jodi Hildebrandt's form of therapy and her theories about it, a consistent theme is that separation between husband and wife, saying that the husband is harmful and evil and dangerous to the family, and so he needs to be separated and I guess figure things out for himself before they can reintegrate. And it just seems like very few of the families ever actually ended up reintegrating.
she, Jodi Hildebrandt, is responsible.
During the separation, Kevin was attending men's groups that were facilitated by Jodi, and during those groups, he was being downgraded and diminished, and told how bad he was, and that he needed to repent, and that the best way to repent was to not infect his family with his problems, and so that's why you need to stay away. He wasn't the only one in those men's groups that was undergoing exactly what he was undergoing at her suggestion and recommendation.
For all this talk of being like an evil genius and mastermind, she wasn't all that creative. Like, the way that she treats children and the way that she treats adults was pretty much the same. Was saying like, you're evil and you need to repent, and the best way to repent is to be punished over and over again. It's just like, learn a different tune, you know?
So again, not surprising that they are saying it is her fault and she needs to pay up. The part that is really interesting to me in this filing, where does all the money come from? So the filing states, quote, the defendant has assets and resources sufficient to assist in the payment of this restitution in the form of real estate, financial accounts, and other personal property. Let's start with that last part, the property and the accounts. So, quote, the defendant owns other personal property of value, including automobiles, a side-by-side, and at the time of the commission of these crimes, had financial accounts, including but not limited to proposed checking, savings, certificates of deposit, 401k, and all other such accounts either in the name of the defendant or being held by other third parties or entities, including but not limited to Pam Bacher, Connections LLC, or other third parties or entities. Now,
Somebody at that law firm did their homework. Well, I guess this is also how they're going to get paid, so there's probably some self-interest involved. I mean, yeah, Jodi Hildebrandt was making a lot of money, and one of her former victims had talked about how she would split couples up so that she could double up on how much she was charging them because they were going to men's groups like the lawyer had talked about in Kevin Franke's case, and women's groups and couples counseling and then separate individual sessions. She was making bank off of this stuff, and so apparently she had invested that quite well.
Now, be clear, Pam Bacher is the president of Connections Foundation. She was actually on that body cam footage from officers when they found Ruby's other two young children at Pam's house in American Fork, Utah. At the time, she had picked them up before Ruby's arrest, but Pam Bacher hasn't been charged with any crimes or anything like that. Theoretically, these different forms of property could potentially be used to satisfy a restitution order. But then there is the real estate. Quote, petitioner discovered that on or about Thursday, January 4th, 2024, this is, by the way, after Jodi Hildebrandt pled guilty, the defendant, Jodi Hildebrandt, has listed for sale her home and real property located in Ivins, Utah, which was at least one location where these crimes were committed against the children. The listing for sale of the home has, as a listing price, $5.1 million. Wow, I guess that was a successful practice that she had. Goes on to say, quote,
I don't know what therapist has a $5.1 million home. If therapy is your full-time job and you have that expensive of a home, the math does not add up.
It is assumed that there is significant equity in the home. However, without knowledge of the existing mortgage, petitioner, this is of course Kevin Franke, is not aware of the exact amount of anticipated profit. However, to the extent there is profit, the children should be entitled to a share sufficient to provide restitution for any and all ongoing expenses that they incur as a result of this defendant's crimes against them. Now, the court has to balance not only these financial resources of Hildebrandt in determining restitution, or what the restitution amount should be, but also the burden that this would impose in light of Hildebrandt's other creditors and financial obligations. So it's a little bit of a test there for the court. However, as Randy Kester lays out, they need the court to act quickly on this. Why? Because the defendant, they say, is in the process of assigning, disposing of, or concealing the property, and there is probable cause of losing the remedy of restitution unless the court issues the writ and or the temporary restraining order.
Wow, so that, I knew there was a lot of discourse around her selling her house really suddenly, so this is probably the clearest explanation I've had of why this is a concern, and that she's trying to get the profit from selling the house and then tuck it away somewhere so that she can't lose it to the victims. And also, as he was talking about the children getting a share of the profits and things like that, I just wonder like how long the line must be if suddenly you open up restitution for damages. Like, you have a lot of families, individuals who can line up to take a chunk out of her estate.
And that order would stop Hildebrandt from selling or transferring any of this property in any way until restitution can be resolved. So the idea here is that we have to make sure there's something still here, something left over in order to pay for the kids' costs. So Kevin is asking for an emergency order stopping Hildebrandt from doing anything with her assets until this restitution is heard at a sentencing on February 20th. And we will see what happens. It's going to be interesting. But at the very least, I think the biggest takeaway from all of this, just incredibly sad to hear what these two young children are apparently going through, what they need to do in order to recover. Difficult for any victim, let alone two young children.
I'm glad that he refocused on the kids in the end. I think it's really easy to get caught in the legalese and the network of what Jodi Hildebrandt's trying to do and how manipulative she can be by putting her house on sale. An otherwise innocent act, but could be a form of protecting herself from losing some of that money and the equity that she has in that home. But yeah, I mean, let's talk about that trauma that the kids could experience. Yes, there are some real costs associated with the physical and emotional abuse that they suffered. And I talked about how beliefs can be completely warped. People's approach to life can be completely twisted by trauma. And so all of these costs are not just a way to get back at Jodi Hildebrandt, but a very real cost to the medical care and the mental health care that these kids could potentially need. Again, I haven't interviewed any of these kids. I don't know these kids. I've never met them. And I do think officials are doing their best to keep the kids out of the spotlight here. But that being said, again, hearing the patterns of what Ruby Franke and Jodi Hildebrandt had done, it's hard to imagine that there's no trauma involved. But that being the case, it would be Jodi Hildebrandt's responsibility to help make things right as much as possible for the kids. Not directly as a therapist, of course, but in terms of them being able to access mental health care at no cost to themselves because they were victims in this case and they shouldn't be the ones paying the cost for that. Everyone, thank you so much for checking out this video. It is a very sad story because after you dig through all the layers and stuff, at the end, he's right. We're looking at two kids who were abused and suffering from a therapist who completely abused her position. But that's why these videos are important, so we can have a better understanding of trauma, a better understanding of how that might affect people who are in abusive situations, how we can understand the relationship between therapist and client and what that should look like and what it should not look like. And so thank you for watching this video. Please like and subscribe to continue supporting the channel. Please consider a membership that helps the channel to grow and for us to continue creating great content for y'all. The link for membership is in the description below. Again, thank you for watching this video. I'll see you all next time.